Welcome back. Let's get started on part 2. I'll share my screen. Bear with me for just a moment. So this is where we are. Section 251H, the requirements. A critical slide. First things first, if a party is going to take advantage of Section 251H, it needs to be expressly stated. Where does it need to be expressly stated? It needs to be expressly stated in the merger agreement. The merger agreement must say that it's permitted or required that the merger be effected under 251H, and it must say that it shall be effected as soon as practicable following the consummation of the offer, the tender offer. So again, it can't be something that's sort of slipshod fallen into. This is highly intentional. This is structured. This is done purposefully. So the notion is we're engaging in this two-step approach. The parties are working collaboratively. They're doing it in all likelihood for purposes of speed and pace. And as a consequence, they're working in this tightly orchestrated format, and they're noting that in the merger agreement. The tender offer that the bidder makes must be a tender offer for all voting stock. So what they cannot say is this is a tender offer for 51% of the company. Now that could be the minimum, but the notion needs to be that the party is making a tender offer for all of the outstanding stock. And this makes some sense, doesn't it? Because the notion here is that the buyer, the purchaser, is interested in acquiring 100% total control of this company. It could do that through the one-step merger process that we've discussed over the course of the semester. No problem, okay? We go from the courting process to the term sheet or the LOI to the definitive documentation that's signed, and then the conditions to closing are discharged and performed, and then we close. Boom, the outstanding shares of Target are converted into the right to receive the deal consideration, and the purchaser acquires complete and total control of the target itself. The assets and liabilities are vested into it or its acquisition sub, the surviving corporation, as the case may be. We are striving to the same goal here. We're just getting there a different way. So it makes sense that there should be a tender offer for all voting stock. And look, if the tender offer is remarkably successful and the buyer is able to acquire 100% of all outstanding voting securities, well, great, then we don't need to do the second step. No need to do the merger. But of course, that's not expected. You're dealing with a large public company with a stockholder base that's widely varied, and the holdings are disparately held and whatnot. So we do expect that that second piece will be required, but the going in position must be it's a tender offer for all voting stock. There's this notion of fait accompli, which we mentioned several times in the first video. Following the consummation of the offer, the acquirer must own at least the percentage of stock that would otherwise be required to adopt the merger agreement under Delaware law and the target's governing documents. In other words, what's happening with this 251H programmatic approach is it's a technical workaround. It's a methodology that is intended to achieve some efficiency because we believe that the other structures associated with the two-step aren't necessary here because it is indeed a fait accompli. So if it's a fait accompli, why bother with these unnecessary steps, these unnecessary hurdles? Let's save all the parties the friction, the time, and the money, but it has to be a fait accompli. Completion: the corporation consummating the tender or exchange offer must merge with or into the target pursuant to the merger agreement. That's the end result. This piece, crucial, same price. The consideration paid for subject shares not tendered and accepted in the tender offer is the same in amount and type as the consideration paid for the shares in the tender offer. This is a critical piece, and this is a heavy differentiation between a friendly two-step transaction under 251H and a hostile two-step transaction, which takes place in either circumstances. Why? Well, let's consider the hostile scenario. In the hostile scenario, our buyer does not have the cooperation or the collaboration, the psychological buy-in of the board of Target. So the hostile bidder, the third party, is going directly to the stockholders with its proposal for a tender offer. And of course, what it's hoping to do is to get to a point where it achieves sufficient control that it could then force the second step, not by means of 251H, because that's not available, but through the means that we described in video 1. Now, what can the hostile tender offer or do? Well, it can say, look, my goal is to get to greater than 50%. The stock is currently trading at, let's say, $30 a share. During the period of the tender offer, I will offer $45 per share in cash. But when the tender offer concludes, and now we're into that second phase, and assuming it's successful, and I'll be engaging in this back-end merger, whereby I will clean out the non-tendering stockholders and acquire complete and total control of this entity, I'm going to offer $32 a share in junk bonds, some kind of subordinated indebtedness, which is certainly not the equivalent of cash. Now, there might be fiduciary issues associated with this. We'll talk about that in the next session. But this sort of approach is not uncommon, subject to fiduciary duty concerns. You see these types of deal structures, perhaps not quite this exaggerated, but it's exaggerated for the purposes of illustration here. You see it happen all the time. Why? Well, because the tender offer, the party making the tender offer wants to create some urgency and wants to create an incentive for the stockholders of Target to participate. Remember, the Target board is against this. And on the schedule 14D9, the Target board has probably said, we do not support this tender offer. Stockholders, please do not participate. Now, some may, but others may take heed of what the board says and hold. So how does this hostile third party incent these stockholders to participate, particularly if perhaps the board is saying, look, we think the company is worth 50, 55, 60. Yes, it's trading at 30, but the market isn't sufficiently valuing it. Hold on to your stock. Don't participate. It's undervalued. And besides that, this ultimate merger that we see coming is bad for the long-term health and the economic outcome of all parties involved. Well, you may believe that as a stockholder. You may believe the board. You may hold that position. But if you feel like there's a reasonable chance that this third party is going to be successful in its tender offer and it's going to get over that 50% hurdle, and then what comes next is a back-end merger where if you're still holding your shares, you're getting these junk bonds at a much lower value, you may say, you know what, this is really disappointing, but I need to participate in this tender offer. I need to play ball. So I'll go ahead and tender my shares and take my $45 in cash per share. I think I should get more, but that's not the hand I've been dealt. I'm forced down this particular avenue. And like I said, we see this with frequency. But this is very different than the 251H situation. You can't have that differentiation. Instead, the whole point is, look, I'm the purchaser. And here's what I'm prepared to do. I'm prepared to pay $45 in cash per share for 100% ownership. I could do a one-step merger the old-fashioned way and pay everyone out at $45 in cash per share. Each share will convert into the right to receive that at the effective time of the merger. Or if we're taking the two-step approach, we can handle it this way, but 251H locks this in. It says, here's the deal. If during the period of the tender offer, you offer $45 in cash per share, well, you know what? In connection with this merger that gets consummated at the closing of the tender offer, the non-tendering tendering stockholders, in other words, the only stockholders left who are going to be subject to this merger agreement, they also get $45 in cash per share. Same price, same security. So it's really this, this Williams Act theme around all holders best price. What you see here is that extended into the back-end merger context to ensure equilibrium and to ensure equitable treatment. And it shouldn't come as any surprise, because this is not a situation where you have a hostile third party trying to game a situation or coerce stockholders into participating. This is friendly. Target board wants to do the deal. And as a consequence, this is simply another way to get from A to B. We could do a one-step merger. We just choose to do a two-step merger, probably because we want to achieve some speed. And so we accomplish it this way. But this is a criterion of enormous import. You can't underestimate how important this is, because it is the prime distinction, I would contend, between a friendly 251H two-step transaction and a hostile two-step transaction. On this slide, we discuss some pros or cons and why you might choose one or the other. The first point here is, if you anticipate a lengthy regulatory process, you probably want to do a simple one-step transaction. And here, the most vivid example would be, say, that of a bank. Banks engage in M&A activity all the time, and it's a highly regulated area. And it's a place where, if we anticipate that there might be issues between or amongst the various agencies and authorities that regulate banks, and if it's going to take an extended period of time to get all of the necessary clearances that the parties need to get to do the deal, you probably should just stick with the one step. It's going to be lengthy. You're not achieving any time savings because of the regulatory outcome. The one step has the benefit of predictability. You just have the simple condition to closing, which is we need these approvals. If we don't get the approvals, the deal doesn't happen. If we do get the approvals, it does. The two-step can introduce some uncertainty. What if you have a successful tender offer, but you don't achieve all of the regulatory clearance first? That puts you in an uncomfortable position betwixt and between. So in that sort of scenario, that type of context, you're typically not going to see 251H entertained. But of course, if speed is important, particularly if the buyer is concerned about interloper risk, that competitive third-party bid, then the two-step process is optimal. What about financing? We're going to talk about financing here shortly, so let's put a pin in this. Hostile deal? Well, it has to be a two-step transaction. It has to be a tender offer and then a merger, but it can't be 251H, right? Because 251H assumes that it's friendly. The language has to appear in the merger agreement up front, so it's just not available in a hostile situation. What's nice about this slide is it provides a very vivid demonstration of the time saving that is achieved through the two-step approach. So let's start with the bottom frame, and then we'll compare it with the top frame. So with the two-step approach, taking advantage of 251H, we start with a signed merger agreement, which expressly says we plan on taking advantage of 251H. We issue a press release, and we file our preliminary communications on Schedule TO. What happens here in week one? We file the Schedule TO, and the board notes on 14D9 that it favors this transaction, and then we also take care of our summary advertisement publications. And then we mail the tender offer materials to the target stockholders. What happens in week 5? The tender offer terminates. 20 business days is usually the approach. That's the minimum amount. The acquirer gains control of target, and now we consummate the merger under 251H. Or if you're above 90%, you can always use the short form merger. I mean, you're not forced to use 251H if you can do a short form merger, if your tender offer is that successful. How does this compare to the one-step approach up above? Okay, well, the process starts with signing the merger agreement. We issue the press release. Okay, same thing. File preliminary communications on Schedule 14A. What's that? It's the proxy statement. We prepare and file the proxy materials, week 2. Week 8 is when the review and comment responses from the SEC are completed. And this is when the proxy materials are printed and they're mailed to the target stockholders. We call the meeting in accordance with Delaware General Corporation Law. We've got our proxy cards. We run the process, we have quorum, we take a vote. The meeting's held, the merger's approved, we close the merger. But look, you're talking about the difference between closing in week 5 and closing in week 12. And the big point of differentiation is the one-step approach requires the solicitation of proxies, and the 251H approach simply requires a Schedule TO. And the SEC is built for speed as it relates to the Schedule TO, and it's not as it relates to proxy statements. You're talking about a 7 or 8 week delta here, which can mean quite a bit if it's a competitive environment and if the buyer is concerned about third-party interlopers. Similar timeline if we're talking about a stock transaction. In the tender offer world, that's referred to as an exchange offer, as you know. Same sort of thing. Process kicks off with signing the merger agreement. We move into filing the Schedule TO and the 14D9, the advertisement. We mail the materials. Week 5, the exchange offer terminates. Acquirer gains control. Close the merger under 251H. What's happening up above with the one-step transaction? Well, we're dealing with the registration statement tied to the securities, of course, as we were below. 425 holds under both cases, but we have the proxy statement. So we have alignment around Rule 425, but we don't have alignment around the proxy statement. You need a proxy statement up above, you don't need one below, and that accounts for the extra time. And again, if we have interloper concerns, that's problematic. Now let's talk a little bit about strategic buyers versus financial buyers and how their concerns are implicated within the context of merger transactions in general and the opportunity to do a two-step transaction in particular. So you'll recall the basic distinction that we've drawn between strategic buyers and financial buyers. Strategic buyers are described most generically and generally as operating companies. Facebook would be a strategic buyer. Pfizer would be a strategic buyer. Salesforce would be a strategic buyer. Coca-Cola would be a strategic buyer. Financial buyers have behind them funds, private equity funds, or other organized pools of money that are looking to acquire companies primarily for purposes of investment. And they hope to then build certain efficiencies into those acquired assets and then sell them later for gain. Early in the semester, when we were comparing and contrasting strategic buyers and financial buyers and their style and approach, we noted that strategic buyers will often use cash off the balance sheet to buy a company. They will often use their own stock to buy a company. But what they rarely do is borrow funds to buy a company. They don't finance transactions very often. They can, and they sometimes do. So don't take this as an all-encompassing, it never happens, but it just doesn't happen very often. In contrast with a financial buyer, it's very different. There may be some use of stock. You do see that sometimes, but these deals with private equity buyers tend to be driven primarily in the direction of cash. And you'll recall in talking about the way these transactions work is they look a lot like residential real estate. How? Well, you're buying a house, and that house is $100,000. You make a $20,000 down payment. That's the cash you bring to the closing table, and you borrow $80,000 from the bank. This gives you the $100,000 that you pay to the seller, right? Now, this $80,000 is not just a naked loan. It needs to be secured by something. It needs collateral. So what is that collateral? Is it other assets that the borrower already has, the buyer of the home? No. The asset that secures this $80,000 loan is the house itself. That's what the mortgage is. Okay, it gives the lender, it gives the bank a lien on that asset, so that if the borrower goes into default as it relates to the repayment obligations on that $80,000 loan, the bank, the lender, has recourse against the house. And what's so interesting about this, and we take it for granted, is that what we have is we have a situation where the buyer is acquiring an asset, and 80% of the purchase price, 80%, is coming from a loan that is secured by that asset that the buyer doesn't have yet. Okay, they don't have until they get to the closing table, and then this all happens at once. This is a form of leveraged buyout. Okay, it's an LBO. Whenever you buy a house, it's a leveraged buyout. That's how private equity firms work as well. When they buy a company, right? Typically you have the fund, and the normal structure would be is it would set up some kind of acquisition sub, and it's looking to buy target, and the transaction takes place at this level. And 80%, pretty typical ratio, 80% of the funds used to acquire target, to pay to target stockholders, comes from debt. It's financed. There's a loan. And that debt, that loan is secured by the assets of target, the assets to be acquired, just like residential real estate. Well, in a one-step transaction, it's very smooth and elegant. As I said, this all happens at the final closing table. The buyer shows up prepared to write a check for the 20% that it's bringing, prepared to bring the other 80% in funds that it's borrowing in that moment from the bank. The bank gets an immediate lien on the assets that the buyer just acquired, and the seller gets all its money. That all happens in one fell swoop at closing. In a two-step transaction, it's more complicated. Because remember, when the tender offer closes, the bank can't yet be confident that it's going to have access to all of the assets of seller in order to secure the ultimate purchase price, because there still needs to be that second merger, that back end merger to complete the total consummation. You're only halfway there. Banks don't like halfway there. Banks like all the way there. So before 251H, note these numbers are measured from 2010 to 2013, you didn't see very many two-step transactions within the context of financial buyers. Only 15% of these deals were structured that way. Whereas on the strategic side, where you're not using financing as often, two-step transactions accounted for 39.4%, almost 40% of the acquisition structures were structured that way. A tender offer followed by a back-end merger. This was even without 251H. So they were fine leaning on this structure here, okay? The 12-week process. Why was it a 12-week process, even though it was two-step? Because you still needed the proxy statement, all right? You didn't get to skip it. So you have the tender offer followed by the merger, but you didn't get to jump right into the merger because you had the proxy statement process. So what it did is it had the stretch of extending the time frame. But maybe it could still be done a little bit more quickly, and maybe that's why you opted for it. But the bottom line is it was feasible for strategic buyers, not so feasible for financial buyers. Well, that changed a little bit with 251H. Because it can be teed up so that you have the tender offer and the merger happening on the same day, banks can get more comfortable with that. And we've seen that. This gap between strategic buyers using a two-step approach 40% of the time and financial buyers only using it 15% of the time, we've seen this gap close over the last 8 years since 251H was implemented, because there's more certainty, right? It's a friendly transaction. It's hardwired into the merger agreement, which is signed when the tender offer is commenced. This whole thing is hardwired to take place. It's more certain. Banks like certainty. It's a good thing. And so as a consequence, 251H has opened up the two-step approach for financial buyers in a way that previously was not the case. And that's an important takeaway point. So that's it as it relates to this basic topic of tender offers, advanced merger structures.